Who was Walter Higgins really writing that letter to, and why did he wait until he was gone to say it? What debt did a quiet janitor from Millbrook, Ohio, believe he owed to a town that barely noticed him? And why, after 31 years of silence, did he choose his final words to reveal a secret that would eventually pit neighbor against neighbor, cousin against cousin, in a fight that none of them expected to have? Those questions sat in that town hall room like a weight nobody could lift. The lawyer folded his hands and told the council that the letter could not be read that day. Ohio law required verification first, and so an entire town went home that night carrying $4 million worth of unanswered questions. To understand what Walter Higgins left behind, you first have to understand who he was before Millbrook ever knew his name. Walter grew up the youngest of 6 children on a failing dairy farm outside of Dayton, the kind of childhood where dinner wasn't always guaranteed and shoes were handed down until there was nothing left to hand down. At 18, he enlisted, hoping the Army would give him a life his father never could. It was there, in a barracks in the summer of 1968, that Walter met a young soldier named Thomas Doyle, a boy from Millbrook who talked endlessly about the town he grew up in, the church on 5th Street, the diner on Main, and a girl back home he intended to marry the moment he returned. Walter and Thomas became inseparable. They trained together, ate together, wrote letters home together, and somewhere in that friendship, Walter began to feel something he had never felt on that failing dairy farm. He began to feel like he belonged somewhere. Thomas talked about Millbrook so often that Walter could picture the town before he had ever set foot in it. He knew the name of the butcher. He knew which pew the Doyle family sat in every Sunday. He knew about the girl, whose name was Ruth, and how Thomas planned to build her a house on the edge of town the moment he came home from the war. Walter used to tease him about it. Thomas used to tell him he'd be the best man at the wedding. Thomas Doyle never made it home. He was killed just outside of Da Nang in the spring of 1969, 3 months before his enlistment was set to end. Walter carried him the final quarter mile to the medevac helicopter himself, and he never spoke about that day again for the rest of his life. What he did instead was quieter, and it would take 31 years for anyone to understand it. When Walter's own service ended, he did not go back to Dayton. He got on a bus to a town he had never seen, carrying a duffel bag and a promise he had made to a friend who never got the chance to keep it himself. Walter arrived in Millbrook in the autumn of 1970 and told no one why he had come. He found work at the school, rented a small room above the hardware store, and began attending the church on 5th Street, sitting quietly in the back pew, watching the Doyle family without ever introducing himself. He never told them who he was. He never told them about the medevac helicopter or the promise or the girl named Ruth who eventually married someone else and moved 2 towns over, never knowing that a stranger sweeping floors at the local school had once carried the man she loved to safety with his own 2 hands. Walter simply watched and worked and saved month after month, year after year, for 31 years. The incident, if you can call it that, was not an explosion or a confrontation. It was a decision, made quietly in a bank office in 1974 to open an account in the name of a promise nobody living had ever heard him make. Walter decided that if he could not bring Thomas Doyle home, he could at least give something back to the town Thomas had loved so deeply that a dying man's final coherent words were about a church pew and a girl and a house he would never build. Walter spent 3 decades turning a dead soldier's memory of home into a fortune large enough to change that home forever, and he did it without a single person in Millbrook ever suspecting what was happening right in front. When the letter finally became public 2 weeks later, the town of Millbrook did not know what to do with what it had learned. The lawyer confirmed the account was real, the fortune was real, and Walter's instructions were legally binding. But almost immediately, a complication surfaced. A distant relative of Walter's, a nephew from Dayton who had not spoken to him in over 20 years, filed a claim against the estate, arguing that family blood should come before a promise made to a man who had been dead for more than 50 years. The nephew hired a lawyer of his own. Millbrook split into 2 camps almost overnight, some insisting the town had no right to Walter's money, others insisting the fortune belonged exactly where Walter intended
it to go. Reporters from Columbus began showing up outside the town hall. The story of the secret millionaire janitor spread across the state, then beyond it, and with that attention came scrutiny. Investigators combed through decades of banking records to confirm the money was legitimate. Old classmates and co-workers were interviewed. Someone found an old photograph of Walter in uniform, standing beside a young man nobody in Millbrook recognized. And for a while, no one could explain who that second soldier was. It took a genealogist working alongside the estate lawyer nearly a month to trace the name on the back of that photograph to a family that still lived only 20 minutes outside of Millbrook. A family that had spent 50 years wondering about the man who carried Thomas Doyle those final yards to safety. The Doyle family had never known his name. They knew only that a fellow soldier had tried to save Thomas, and that this soldier had written them a single condolence letter in 1969, signed only with the initials IBUH. When Ruth Doyle's daughter, now in her 50s, sat across from the estate lawyer and heard the full story for the first time, she did not know how to hold the grief and the gratitude in the same breath. Her mother had lived 2 towns over for 50 years, never knowing that the quiet janitor who used to fix the church's leaking roof on 5th Street was the same man who had carried her first love, those final impossible steps toward a helicopter that arrived just minutes too late. The revelation reshaped everything Millbrook thought it understood. Walter had not simply been a frugal old man with no family and nowhere else to put his money. He had spent 31 years quietly repaying a debt no court could have ever required him to pay, choosing to live small so that a promise made to a dying friend could one day become something enormous. The nephew's claim, once it became public knowledge exactly why Walter had made. The choices he made did not hold up long in the court of public opinion, even before it was settled in an actual courtroom. People who had walked past Walter Higgins 1,000 times without a second glance suddenly found themselves unable to stop thinking about him. Here is the final piece nobody saw coming. Walter's letter contained one more instruction tucked beneath the larger gift to the town. A portion of the fortune, nearly $600,000, was set aside specifically and by name for Ruth Doyle's daughter, the child of the woman Thomas Doyle had promised to marry, a woman Walter had never once spoken to in 50 years of living in the same small town. He had watched her grow up from a distance. He had attended her wedding, sitting quietly in the back pew, the same way he always did. He never explained himself, never asked for anything in return, and never once let her know the role he had played in a story that began before she was even born, and named in his honor. Ruth Doyle's daughter used her portion to send her own children to college, debt-free, a gift she said she still struggles to fully understand, even now. What Walter Higgins left behind was never really about the money. It was about what one man was willing to sacrifice, quietly and without recognition, to keep a promise made to a friend who never got the chance to come home. So here is the question we want you to sit with. If you had walked past Walter Higgins on the street, would you have ever guessed the weight he was carrying? Tell us in the comments what you would do if you discovered a promise like that had been made in your name, without your knowledge, 50 years ago. And if this story moved you the way it moved us, wait until you hear the next one, because what happened when a small-town nurse in Georgia was left an inheritance from a patient she met only once is a story that very few people have ever heard the full truth about. Make sure you're subscribed, because we tell one story like this every single week, and you will not want to miss what comes next.